Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lisa Millette, and I am a member of the Saki TTA team, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items for you. If technical support is needed, please let us know through the chat window or by emailing sakitta@rti.org. If you have any questions regarding today's material, please type them into either the chat window or you can use the Q&A function, and we will retain your questions for the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of the presentation. We will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we will also send out an email announcement to all who have registered. This announcement will also include a PDF copy of today's presentation, and you can also view all of our archived webinars on the Saki TTA website under the webinars section. This is the webinar, Best Practices for Bloodstain Pattern Analysis in Cold Cases of Sexual Assault and Homicide, presented by Jennifer Dillon and John Wilkinson.
There we go.
All right, perfect. Points of views or opinions in this document are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. The portions of this presentation prepared by Jennifer Dillon were done so in her own capacity. Jennifer Dillon is a forensic scientist with the Michigan State Police and has casework experience in multiple disciplines, including body fluid identification, DNA, trace evidence, footwear, tire track, bloodstain pattern analysis, and crime scene response. She has a passion for continuing education to include being of service to the criminal justice community through teaching on topics such as DNA, cold case investigations, trace evidence, evidence collection and preservation, crime scene management, and bloodstain pattern recognition and documentation. Jennifer also advocates the use of mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques to mitigate common stressors experienced in the field of forensic science and law enforcement first responders. She strives to cultivate a shift in culture to build resiliency and sustainability within the workplace by providing educational content for the Mental Agility Development Series for the Midwestern Association of Forensic Scientists. This program provides resources to strengthen mental fitness, including the Mental Agility for Forensic Scientists podcast, which Jennifer hosts. John F. Wilkinson, an attorney advisor with Equitas, presents on trial strategy, legal analysis and policy, and ethical issues related to violence against women at the local, state, national, and international level. He conducts research, develops training materials, resources, and publications, and provides case consultation and technical assistance for prosecutors and allied professionals. John served as an assistant Commonwealth's attorney in Fredericksburg, Virginia, prosecuting cases involving intimate partner violence and sexual assault, including cases of campus sexual assault and domestic violence homicide. He also served on the Fredericksburg area sexual assault response team and prosecuted child sexual and physical abuse and neglect cases and infant homicides. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. Today's presentation should cover the following objectives. John and I hope to bring to you a foundational basis of the science of bloodstain pattern analysis, and also to explain the history of past practices and also current practices. We know that we're focusing here on cold cases, so we understand that we might be looking at a lot of older cases. So we want you to understand both the historical aspect and the current best practices of bloodstain pattern, both documentation and the analysis, and help you to assess if documentation in your case is adequate to request bloodstain pattern analysis in a cold case. So if it hasn't been performed yet, do you have enough information to move forward with a new analysis? We also hope to help to prepare you for testimony to include discovery requests and pretrial conferences, educate judges and juries about the significance of bloodstain pattern analysis, and anticipate and respond to defense challenges at trial. So I will be presenting the foundations of the science I spent about 10 years as an active bloodstain pattern analyst with the Michigan Department of State Police. And so I can bring you as much of my experience as possible here today and give you a little bit of education about the foundational theories behind bloodstain pattern analysis. Essentially, bloodstain pattern analysis, or BPA, if I refer to it as BPA for short, is the examination of the size, shape, distribution, and locations of bloodstains at crime scenes in an attempt to establish the physical events that gave a rise to their origin. So essentially, we're arriving at a crime scene and looking at all of the different bloodstain patterns that are present, trying to determine if we can classify those patterns and make a determination about the way in which the blood was deposited on those various surfaces, sometimes referred to as targets. So we might be analyzing bloodstain patterns on the wall, bloodstain patterns on a body, bloodstain patterns on the floor, so vertical, horizontal surfaces, three-dimensional, moving objects. We are understanding that people and objects are moving throughout the process of whatever crime was committed. So we have to take all of that into account. The science behind this process is because blood is a fluid, we can always rely on the physical laws that are going to be adhering to the fluid, right, to the blood. So these patterns can be predictable and we can be reproducible under similar conditions. So we may, as part of our analysis, perform experimentation to see if we can recreate the pattern. There are essentially two types of bloodstain patterns, transfer, or what we could call just non-spatter type stains, and spatter stains. So I will explain the difference between those patterns to you. Essentially, a transfer stain is going to be the result of contact between a blood-bearing surface and another surface, meaning if I have blood on my hands at a scene, for example, and then I touch the wall, I will be transferring blood from one object to another. So a blood-bearing surface to a non-blood-bearing surface. Transfer. It can indicate movement. So for example, you may be able to be processing a scene and recognize that an object touched a wall perhaps, and then traveled, there was movement along that wall. And I'll get into that a little bit further. We also may see what we call spatter stains. A spatter stain is the result of a blood drop being dispersed through the air as a result of an external force being applied to a liquid blood source. So anytime you've got action, striking blood, for example, and then blood is traveling through the air, the blood will disperse into various sized blood droplets, travel through the air, and then land on a target or on a surface and create a particular pattern. So it's important to remember that because we've got moving parts in any type of action, that we may see parts of the pattern, we may be able to see the whole pattern. Things may have been removed from the scene by the time we're able to view these patterns. So I will give you the most simplistic examples today, but please just know that sometimes we have these patterns on top of patterns. Sometimes we're only seeing a partial pattern. Sometimes there's cleanup. So things can get pretty complicated in a scene, just depending on how much activity was going on. From a bloodstain pattern, we're trying to determine as much as we can about the reconstruction of the scene. So for example, we may be able to determine the approximate position of the victim at the time of bloodshed, depending on the types of patterns that we see. We may be able to approximate the position of other subjects. So perhaps we may see some bloody footwear impressions, and that would indicate to us movement throughout the scene. And maybe depending on the different types of tread design patterns we see, we may be able to make a determination that there were, one or more individuals walking about the scene. We can determine the area of origins of the bloodstain patterns. I'll be talking about that a little bit later, but essentially that would be trying to determine where in space the object was when the the force was applied to the blood to create a pattern. And sometimes that can be very helpful. Typically, that's going to be a situation in which someone is trying to determine the reconstruction. It was the person upright, near upright, down on the floor. So we're trying to determine, all we can see right now is where the pattern is, but we're trying to determine where did the pattern originate from. Sometimes we can determine the sequence of events that created the specific patterns. So if we see a pattern that's overlying another pattern, then we may be able to make a determination. Obviously, whatever pattern would be on top would have had to occur secondary to the original pattern. It can be possible. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, and we know that we have two patterns on top of one another, but we can't make a determination about which one occurred first. But we certainly can try to make that determination. We can also determine if there was movement of objects or people at the scene. For example, if a victim was rolled over at some point and then the blood, perhaps which was flowing from the nose or mouth, then begins to flow in another direction, right? Because blood will always flow in the direction of gravity. So you may see just a change in that direction of blood flow, and that would indicate that there was movement of the body at the scene. We also may be able to see a pattern, like movable objects within a scene. For example, let's say there is a pattern that occurred on a kitchen table. And on that kitchen table, there were items that then were moved after that pattern was created. So we might find a vase, for example, on the floor, perhaps broken, that has a pattern on it. And we would be able to make a determination that pattern probably wasn't, that vase wasn't there in the original mechanism of deposition. It was likely on top of the table when it occurred. So if there's objects been moved, and that could be maybe weapons that were removed, again, bodies that were moved. Sometimes if it's a cleanup scene, people will completely rearrange furniture. We've had scenes where when you walked in, things looked pretty tidy, but you started flipping over couch cushions and completely recreated a couch that had tremendous amounts of blood staining on the couch. So you can tell that there had been a lot of movement post bloodshed. And then really to tie everything together, we want to see if we can determine ultimately, is there an agreement or disagreement between what we're seeing at the scene and if there are any statements that might have been made either by a witness, a suspect statement, a victim statement. Do things line up with the physical evidence that we're seeing, with the DNA results that we have? So it's really just a way to really tie everything together with crime scene reconstruction. So it's important to remember that we're looking at the static result of blood droplets, which were moving through the air and creating a pattern on a specific target. Lots of things can happen after that blood was after that blood was dispersing through the air. Things can happen to those patterns. So it's just important for an analyst and also for an investigator that's maybe looking at a case afterward to know what has happened during the crime scene processing and afterward, what has happened with that evidence. Because we're really looking at the after effects. Certain artifacts can be created during scene processing. So an example that I could give would be if the medical examiner investigator comes into the scene and moves the body, we've seen additional bloodstain patterns created simply by moving the body out of the scene. Or clothing that's wet and it's picked up and packaged and it's not packaged appropriately, it's maybe crumpled up before it's put into a paper bag, for example, and bloodstain patterns are now transferred onto another area of that shirt. So depending on how old the case is or if we're fresh at the scene, we have to be aware of all of those things. The amount of information that we see from a resulting pattern is going to determine our ability to really make any sort of conclusion about how that pattern arrived there. So all of the things that I just mentioned can complicate and sort of blur the lines between what we can say and what we can't, especially if we're looking at a cold case. It is possible, by the way, to make some determinations about bloodstain pattern analysis without physically being at a scene. So if we are looking at photographs, for example, that's even less information that we might have. Our conclusions may be limited. So just a little bit of history for you all with regards to bloodstain pattern analysis. It really has been studied for quite a long time. Going back to 1895 was the first documented study, including determining the directionality of bloodstain patterns. But really some of the most important dates for me anyway are not until the 50s, 1970s. Herb McDonnell is considered the father of modern bloodstain pattern analysis. He began, created some schools, and that's where teachers started teaching students to get out there and do their own type of analysis. It wasn't until the early 80s that the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysis was formed. So any sort of consensus about what types of terminology was used or anything of that sort, what types of conclusions should be made versus what were being made, none of that stuff really began to formulate until around this time frame. Jumping to 1990, the International Association of Identification accepted bloodstain pattern analysis as a forensic discipline. And then the FBI formed one of the SWIG groups, scientific working groups for bloodstain pattern analysis, was called SWIGstain. And that was developed in 2002. So depending on how old your cold cases are, referring to a timeline like this can give you an idea of how much consensus there was, because if there wasn't a consensus body beginning to talk about this type of analysis, you may see a variety of casework, documentation, and conclusions. And really, 2009 and beyond deserves its whole new era of bloodstain pattern analysis. As many of you know, in 2009, the NAS report was released, and that report really, aside from saying that the DNA was the gold standard, if you will, all of the other disciplines in the forensic field was called out as needing more standardizations. So you really begin to see standardization in terminology released in the same time frame. So 2009, SWIGstain came out with recommended terminology. This was around the time that I actually began conducting casework in bloodstain pattern analysis. And it was an interesting time frame because there were terminology that people were using and had used for years that were no longer considered consistent. And so the terminology had to shift, right? And everybody who was conducting casework was to use this new terminology, or recommended to use this new terminology. And it took several years. I learned it with this new terminology, but I would hear people and be like, "Oh, what's that word? I've never heard that term used before." And they were still using old terminology. So this is an important time frame just to keep in mind, because there could be terminology from a case anytime before 2009, and probably really I would give some buffer area, because again, these were recommended terms. And so maybe even into early 2010s, people were still using some of the older terminology. Moving on to 2014, this is when NIST began to create the OSAC committees. And these committees for forensic science disciplines really began in all of the disciplines really, but bloodstain pattern analysis had its own group. And so they began to create standards, and they really adopted the SWIGstain terminology standards. And SWIGstain had created several other standards as well that they adopted. And then in 2015, AFS created the ASB board, so the Academy Standards Board. Bloodstain pattern analysis had a board, a consensus body to create standardized guidelines. Again, they used a lot of Swigstain's work was reviewed, had, clarifications and discussions, and they used a lot of what Swigstein had built upon. 2016 PCAST report is released, again, calling for further standards and guidelines, and really starting to lean into clarification into the reliability and standards for error for all of the different disciplines, even DNA at this point. So we've really entered this time and era in which all forensic science disciplines are being asked to buckle down and really create some standards that the whole community agrees with and abides by. Bloodstain pattern analysis is completely immersed in this idea of standardization. So you'll see, depending on what type of cold case you're looking at, if there has been work performed prior to 2009, it may be held to a different standard because there really weren't many at the time. So I'm not saying that the work wasn't complete and that it wasn't accurate, that it wasn't based in science. I'm just saying that there wasn't a consensus that the work was being held to. So you'll see some of the standards that the ASB has released since 2017. Again, the terms and definitions are the same ones that were being used, created by Swigstein since 2009. So that really wasn't that new. But there are procedures as far as the analysis, as far as keeping a quality assurance program in check, as far as how to train a bloodstain pattern analysis and how reports should be written. So I will go through some of that today, and just to give you a clear idea of what you should see. If in current work, this is what you should see. And if you're presenting a cold case to an analyst for new interpretation, they're going to be working off of these guidelines as well. So important to note that there's a difference between bloodstain pattern documentation and bloodstain pattern analysis. Documentation is simply going to the scene and taking notes, photographs, and sketches, just like you would any other type of evidence. The difference might be that there's a little bit more involved with bloodstain pattern analysis than, say, just a shirt lying on the floor. But it can all be taught to an evidence technician and doesn't take too much training above the minimal training that any evidence technician would have. The analysis of those patterns, meaning giving a little bit of conclusions based on the patterns that were observed, needs to be done by a trained professional. And typically, if it's going to be a trained bloodstain pattern analyst, they will be working probably within an accredited laboratory, and as a requirement, will have all of their work peer reviewed and assessed before a report is released. So this is an example of some of the recommended training that a bloodstain pattern analyst would have. They would, likely also have a college degree, a bachelor's degree in a science. And then there may or may not be an in-house training program that might include a competency test and a written exam. They would certainly have a 40-hour basic course. That's a standard course that all of us take before we become trained and are able to author a report. There's also several 36-hour advanced courses that can be taken. And a big one that is highly encouraged is to take a fluid dynamics of bloodstain pattern formation. The analyst should likely be proficiency tested once a year. And if they're working in an accredited lab, that specific discipline may be accredited. It's possible that that discipline is not accredited within the lab. Just because a laboratory is accredited doesn't mean that every discipline is specifically accredited. So just something to be aware of. The analyst should always be engaged in continuing their education, whether that be attending workshops or keeping up to date on peer-reviewed journal articles, and may have a membership in a professional organization related to bloodstain pattern analysis. That organization could be the IAI. There's the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts. So just something to keep them up to date, to remain in consensus with the overall community that's conducting the casework. All right, so I'm going to briefly go through some classifications of bloodstain patterns. So just explaining to you the types of patterns that one might see at a crime scene and show you some photographs as well. So the photographs, I'll give you a warning slide, but they are graphic in nature because they're blood stains, but they're mostly were created during training events. So a drip stain first is a blood stain that's resulting from a falling drop due to gravity. So just imagine if you were to cut your finger and blood were to drip from the tip of your finger onto a flat surface, it would likely create a circular stain, right? If you were to continue moving about a room, then you might leave what's called a drip trail, which would be several of those drip patterns, in a line between two different points. So this is an example of some drip stains and also of a drip trail. And let me see if I can get my laser pointer going for you. So I'm talking about these circular stains that you may see, and some of the things that can be determined with a drip stain, especially with a drip trail, may indicate movement between 2 points, right? In this case, particularly, the two stains or areas of stainings that are circled, one drip stain is underneath an open drawer and one is inside an open drawer. So one of the conclusions that a bloodstain pattern analyst may be able to make is that that drawer was opened during the blood shedding event, right? Because there's a blood stain that's underneath the drawer. And so that blood stain would only get there if someone were physically crawling underneath or if it landed while the drawer was still closed. And at some point that drawer was open, and that's how that blood stain, there's two blood stains, it looks like in there, two drip stains landed in the drawer. So just for an example, at a crime scene, many times I may be processing a scene and then I go into the kitchen, I open up a drawer and there's a blood stain inside, right? So because I know the drawer was found in the closed position, I can make some sort of conclusion that at some point the drawer was closed, at some point the drawer was open, blood was deposited inside, and then it was closed again. So sometimes it's because that's a kitchen drawer with knives inside and somebody was reaching in to grab for something, right? So these are the things that are documented, hopefully in notes form and also photographic form, because perhaps if I were looking at just this photograph, I may not be able to make the conclusion that that blood stain was underneath that drawer. But if it was in my notes, then that would be helpful, or if additional photographs were taken. Moving on, a transfer stain, I briefly mentioned, is a blood stain resulting from contact between a blood-bearing surface and another surface. Sometimes we can make a determination about what type of object transferred the pattern onto the object. So for example, if I had blood on my hand and I touched a wall, then I may transfer a pattern that was in the shape of my hand. You may very often at a scene see portions of, what may be fingers or a palm stain. Footwear impressions are a really big one. Sometimes we're able to see actual impressions of a weapon that was used. We've seen scenes where maybe the knife blade had some blood on it and then was transferred either onto the suspect's clothing if they were wiping the knife, trying to clean it, or if the object were set down on a surface, then we would see a transfer of a particular pattern. So that would just be a general transfer stain. We can get more specific with the definition and talk about swipe patterns and wipe patterns. A swipe pattern, the way I remember this, is that a swipe is the transfer of blood from a blood-bearing surface to another. So if I had blood on my hand and I swiped across the wall, I would leave a pattern, right? Versus if I find a wipe pattern, that is a blood stain that's already on a surface, and then I move through that blood stain. So the way that I always remember it is that I wipe up a liquid mess on the counter. So I always think, like, if I spilled milk in my kitchen, I would wipe it up, right? So I remember that definition, blood's already there and something is moving through the object, versus a swipe, blood is already on the object and it's moving across a surface that doesn't have a pattern. So I'll show you some pictures. For example, here, there's multiple patterns going on here, but you see some of this, these patterns right here. I don't know if you can make it out, but there's actually a partial hand transfer pattern here. So you can see a little bit of the palm, you can see some of the fingertips. There's some movement through here. So that's just a real general transfer type pattern. This is another transfer pattern. These are, again, several patterns on top of one another. So it can get complicated, and we can't always determine if it's a swipe versus a wipe. So sometimes we'll just be very general and say it's a transfer stain. This is a very classic wipe stain. So you can see here, this is a drip stain. And these are also drip stains. You can see the perimeter staining where the stain has begun to dry, and then there was movement through the stain. And in this type of stain, you can say a little bit more. I could say that there was movement from the left to the right direction because there's no change in the edge characteristics of this stain right here, but you can clearly see that the blood is pushed, moved in this direction, and moving past the perimeter staining here on this side. So sometimes you can tell a lot more with a wipe, the direction of movement that is, than you can with a swipe. But all of those swipes or wipes are indicating movement. We'll see a lot of this type of staining if a victim is upright and moving about after bloodshed. And it can say a lot about how much movement occurred and where, sort of starting to sequence events. So it can be very helpful. Moving on, a projected pattern is a bloodstain pattern resulting from the ejection of blood under hydraulic pressure, typically from a breach in the circulatory system. So really, this is when an artery is breached. Usually it is the carotid artery. And if the victim is upright and standing, then you may see very large amounts of blood making a rainbow shape, because as the blood is leaving the artery, as the blood is pumping, there's more pressure. And so the blood will have more energy and land a little bit higher. And then as that pressure decreases, the blood will land on the wall a little bit lower. So you'll see, we call it sort of a rainbow effect, an arcing pattern. You can see an example here on this slide. It's usually a large volume of blood, and because there's so much blood and it's landing on a vertical surface, you're seeing a lot of downward flow. That's what you're seeing, all these lines traveling down. It's heavy amounts of blood with downward flow. This is an example of a projected pattern on a horizontal surface. And in this case, you can imagine this being a large amount of blood dropping onto the floor all at once, for example, but with some force. So even if you were to cut your carotid artery or your femoral artery and the blood doesn't land on a vertical surface, it lands on the floor, then we would see something like this. It sort of just looks like a cup of blood poured onto the floor, right? With some pressure. There's a movement. The reason why you see all of these stains around, this is called the pattern, this is the parent stain. And then you see lots and lots of little stains around it. Those are called satellite spatters. Essentially what's occurring is as the blood lands on the floor, there's still energy, and so the blood will come up and disperse into droplets and then land surrounding that parent stain. As opposed to a drip pattern, which these two patterns can be tricky for an early, newly trained bloodstain pattern analyst. A drip pattern is a bloodstain pattern resulting from a liquid that's dripping into another liquid. At least one of them is going to be blood. Here's an example. You can see it looks similar to the projected pattern. You've got this big parent stain, but I'd like to draw your attention to it, almost like you can see individual drip stains. So this pattern is created by dripping blood. So it's really a drip stain on top of a drip stain on top of a drip stain until it creates a pool. And you're going to, once you get a pool, have the blood coming up and creating smaller droplets and then resulting in these satellite spatters surrounding it. So typically a drip pattern is going to be, you may see these individual margins of the drip stains, and you probably won't see in a projected pattern. There's a lot more force. And so you'll see, we call them spines. You can see these little scalloped edges. That's because of the amount of energy, right? The blood is going to spread across the surface, but in a projected pattern, there's so much more energy that these spines will jut out from the edge of the pattern and look like little spiny fingers, you may call that. And so that's usually how we determine the difference between the two. It can be tricky at times. And then an impact pattern. An impact pattern, we may be able to say the most about the area of origin, as I was mentioning earlier. So an impact pattern is created when an object strikes liquid blood. So if, for example, a person was struck with an object, say a bat, the first time you strike that individual, they're not bleeding. So no pattern will be created. But once a wound is created and then there is blood on the object, being the person, if that person is struck again, then a pattern is going to be created. An impact pattern will be created. So these can be really helpful, especially in determining, a lot of times they'll want to correlate the number of impacts to the injuries that are found on the victim. And I can count the number of impact patterns that I see, and I would always be able to say, let's say if I saw 3 impact patterns, I would say then there should be a minimum of 4 impacts, because the first impact would have created blood, but a pattern wouldn't have been formed, because the pattern was only formed when the blood gets struck. And oftentimes, though, the question that will be asked is, was the person upright, near upright, down on the floor when this pattern was created? Typically in cases of self-defense, if you're fighting back, then you should be able to be upright. But if you're down on the floor, if I process a scene and say that I find multiple impact patterns all at floor level, that's an indication that the victim was on the floor while being struck, or that the blood source was on the floor. So this is a pretty classic impact pattern stain. You're going to see really the blood stain radiates in multiple directions. And so this is, like I said, a pretty classic impact pattern. Impact patterns can look very, very different. We don't have time to go through all of them. So you can just know that this is, if you see this at a scene, we can do some stuff with it. This is a good one. A cast-off pattern is when you have blood on an object and then that object is swung through the air and the blood comes off of that object. So while an object is in motion, blood drops are released and they create a pattern. Imagine using an umbrella that's wet. You close your umbrella and you start walking, and as you're swinging your umbrella, if you've ever looked down, it creates a pattern, right? It's fluid dynamics. This is what I said, patterns can be recreated. So as a bloodstain pattern analyst, I'm always finding bloodstain patterns in my everyday activities. If I wash my hands, I'm making patterns on the sink. So cast-off patterns, you may see if you ever carry a wet umbrella, it'll make a line, a linear pattern. And so the same thing will happen with bloodstains. So you can see this very linear pattern. You may see this in a scene if you have, for example, a swinging object, maybe a stabbing type case or a beating case, any object that's got blood on it. I will warn you that another very common scenario is that the victim has blood on their hands and they're moving throughout the scene. So just doing things like this can create cast off. If I have blood on my hand and I move my hand, blood will come off of the fingers, right? So just following the laws of physics. But it's pretty easy to recognize a cast off pattern when it's in its entirety, like this picture depicts. It's just a very linear pattern and it's got some directionality to it. Oops, sorry about that. Another pattern is an expiration pattern. That's a blood stain from blood flow coming out of the airway. So typically it's the nose or the mouth, but it could also be a wound. And a really common way to determine if you have an expiration pattern is that you'll see these air bubbles. So you can see air bubbles in some of these, and that's an indication, right, that there's air in the path of the blood. So if you've got a chest wound, or even if you have mouth blood coming down your face and it's covering your mouth, if you start to cough or you are even just yelling, you can, carry that air through the pattern and create an expirated pattern. And then the last few we have are having to do with gunshot wounds. So you're going to have, with any gunshot wound, you'll have a forward pattern and a backward pattern. Forward spatter is going to be exactly as is described. It's moving forward. So as a projectile enters a body and then creates an exit wound, that projectile will keep going, but also blood from the exit wound will be traveling with it. So if you were to see a spatter pattern on a wall, it would typically be accompanied by an impact site as well. And if you were to investigate inside that impact site, the hole in the wall, then you would anticipate finding a fired fragment, right? So again, you're going to see an impact site, and then you're going to see surrounding it, you may see tissue, you may see hair, and you also may see blood stains. And then coming back, you're also going to have blood that comes from the entrance wound. Typically, this is going to be coming back and traveling only a certain distance. And the items that we might be looking at are the suspect. If it's a gunshot wound, lost my words. If we're talking about a scenario where someone's holding a gun and hits an individual, the blood that's going to come back may land on the gun, may land on the hand of the suspect, possibly on the arm, possibly on the clothing. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at. And sometimes this can be important in a case if we're talking about homicide versus a suicide. Do we see blood on the victim's hand if a gun is maybe placed in the hand after death, for example? We'll be looking for things like that. All right. So just to finish up sort of the real basics here, I kind of briefly mentioned that we can determine the direction of travel. So blood will be traveling in a certain direction and will be indicated by a tail. The tail indicates the forward direction. So I always like to explain it in this scenario. If you look at this depiction of a blood stain, the blood would have hit the surface and continues moving along the surface and is deposited on the surface. And then there's less and less blood to be deposited. And so you end up with this tail. So the tail, I don't like to call it a tail. This is the kind of terminology angst that we all have. The tail to me means that it's behind, right? But it's the leading edge of the stain. And so that indicates the direction of travel. We can take a look at a blood stain and examine its shape and make a determination about the angle that it would have hit the target. A round stain is going to be a 90-degree angle, and then the stain will get more and more elliptical as that angle is decreased. Now, the reason why this is important to us is because of that area of origin that I discussed. So we'll be looking at these patterns. If we see a round stain, for example, a drip stain is circular because it's only affected by gravity. So it's falling off of an object and landing on a surface at a 90-degree angle, round stain. If we see something that's very elliptical and spiny looking, then it hit the surface at a much lower angle. We can calculate that angle by taking measurements of the blood stain. So if you see in this picture, we can measure the length and the width. We're not measuring the tail, just the actual blood stain portion. Apply a little bit of trigonometry, take the inverse sine of the width divided by the length, and that will determine the angle of impact. The angle of impact can then be used to actually determine the three-dimensional area of origin, but we can also take those stains and draw a line right down following the direction, the directionality. So following right along that tail and draw an area of two-dimensional convergence. This is all done on an impact stain. So let me just show you let me just skip ahead and show you this photo because it'll be easier to describe. I'm going back to that classic impact pattern that I showed earlier. This is the same pattern. So you can see here that this tape, there's 6 stains that I have chosen within this impact pattern. And if I took, in this case, string, and I drew it right through the center of those stains, there is a point in which all of those patterns, all of those lines will converge in what's called an area of 2-dimensional convergence. So I'll go back a bit and let you see that definition. That's that 2-dimensional space in which the spatter stains can be retraced to determine the location of the spatter producing event. What's important about finding this area of convergence is that it allows me to say, hey, you're this high off the ground when the spatter event was occurring. So for example, in this photograph, you can see I've got my measurements here on the side, and I can say, somewhere roughly between 43 inches and maybe 50 inches, somewhere in this area was the height at which the bloodshed occurred. Now that's usually good enough to talk about, was the person upright, near upright, down on the floor. If you want to talk about moving away from the wall, how far away from the wall they were, then we would talk about determining the area, the angle of impact, which I just described. So taking those same 6 stains, these stains that are up here at the top, you would calculate the angle of impact, and then you could take string and mark it at exactly that angle, draw it out in 3-dimensional space, and attach a ruler the same way that we do 2-dimensionally, and determine how far away from the wall. Typically, that's not as important as the 2-dimensional. So usually with an impact pattern, we're just working 2-dimensional, but we can sometimes work otherwise. All right, I'm getting way behind, so I'm gonna speed things up a little bit. If I haven't talked fast enough, get ready. Talking about the documentation, so what you might see in a case file is going to be hopefully high quality notes, sketches, and photographs. Exactly what you would do with any other type of evidence you're going to be doing with bloodstain pattern analysis. If a trained analyst was able to take notes physically at the scene, hopefully they were trained to not only classify the pattern, so say this is a cast off, but describe what the stains look like, so that they're not just saying it's cast off. They're saying, I see a linear pattern, directionality moving from left to right, for example. That's the type of high quality notes that we'd prefer to see if someone was physically at a scene. And then it's not just what you see, but also what you don't see. So what spaces are you seeing bloodstains, and then where are you not seeing bloodstains? Are there an interruption of different patterns? Where you're seeing a void, which is actually another type of pattern. So you're not like, as I said, you're not just reading notes and saying, I see an impact pattern, I see this type of pattern. You're actually explaining the size of the stains, the shape of the stains, the direction that you see. So the notes should be pretty specific. And then your photography is just as important as your notes. So I'm just going to briefly go through this road mapping technique, which was developed by Toby Wilson. This was one of the instructors that I took my basic, and also I took an advanced class from Toby. He's from the Miami-Dade Police Department. And essentially, it's just a method to take a very organized method to take photographs of the bloodstains that you see. So you're going to take your overall, your mid-range, and your close-up photographs, but you're going to apply scales and identify, if I were at a scene and I said, okay, I see 3 patterns on the wall, I might label those A, B, and C. And I will take an overall photo, and then I will take a mid-range photo of A, photo of B, photo of C. And then I will get even closer, and maybe within each pattern, I would have A1, A2. And those might be the individual stains that I'm going to take measurements on. And I would have very close-up photographs of those stains. This is ensuring that someone can tech review my work, that I'm not just writing down, I saw this stain. I'm taking photographic evidence, as proof that someone else can, without looking at my classifications, look and make a determination for themselves. So just to walk you briefly through, this is a real quick little scenario You can see that there's some blood staining on the side of the vehicle. There's blood staining on the ground surrounding the vehicle, on the back side of the vehicle. So there's a drip trail that is noticeable, and it goes around to the side of the vehicle. So these would just be those are overall photos. And now I'm starting to identify, along this drip trail. So you should be able to, as I get closer and closer, you should be able to, it's like zooming in, right? But a tech reviewer should be able to piece these pictures back together and recreate the scene. So my photos should be overlapping. I should have lots of references to all of the stains in context to one another. So just some quick examples. I'm always going to want to measure the height from the floor up so that we can see how high up any of the stains are, and then take, mid-range photos and maybe even some further close-up photos. When we're talking about collecting for DNA, we want to think about how many people might have been bleeding. Sometimes we know, sometimes we don't know. But think about that. How many victims? Do we think a suspect was injured? You may want to collect more blood stains if you know you have more bleeders. Some best practices would suggest that you take one stain from each pattern. That could be very difficult if the patterns are overlapping. So you have to sort of think about that. But when I work a scene, I typically do try to take more than I know will be tested in the lab, because I would rather have my choice later because I collected enough stains than say, ooh, wish I would have taken more. I don't want to go there. So always better to collect more than enough. I do recommend if there's a blood trail, you don't have to take, one from each individual stain, but I recommend one from each end and then one from the middle. So that's representative, and work from there. Blood on clothing can be really tricky. It's a heavily requested item, but you have to think about the patterns that are created don't necessarily retain their shape if we're talking about a porous surface. So blood lands on clothing and then it soaks into the fibers. And so it loses its shape, and the shape that we ultimately see on clothing may have little resemblance to the shape that it actually had upon deposition. So directionality generally can't be determined. If it's an impact stain, we may or may not be able to make any determination. I would refer you to read the David Cam case, which is a case in which an Indiana State Police trooper was tried 3 times, spent 13 years in prison before he was finally acquitted. Mostly beginning the first trial, he was convicted mostly upon the bloodstain pattern evidence. The story is that he returned home and found his family, his wife and his 2 children, shot to death inside a vehicle in their garage. He reached into the vehicle and thought that he felt the sun was still warm. So he pulled the sun out of the vehicle. And upon doing so, the question became the 8 stains that were on his shirt, were they high velocity impact spatter? That's an old term that's no longer in usage, but that term implied that you had to be in close proximity of a gunshot. So some experts in that case said that that was consistent with this high velocity impact spatter. So he must have been present at the time of that event. A whole host of other experts testified that that pattern could have also been transfer of spatter stains. So when he reached in to grab the sun, he brushed past his daughter, and it could have been transfer either from impact spatter that was on her, from her hair. And it was a big debate. Half of the bigwig experts in the nation said one thing, and the other half said another. And so that lack of consensus really kind of garnered a lot of debate in the area of bloodstain pattern analysis as a whole, but specifically on clothing. And so it should be noted, again, these were 8 small stains, so really not a lot of evidence to work with. I'm a DNA scientist, so I like to think of that as working with a very partial, limited DNA profile and trying to make a whole conclusion as to whether it was an association. It could be very hard to do. So it's important for an analyst to know that they've got to keep themselves within their limits for sure. All right. Woo, I'm going to pass it over to John now.
That was great, Jennifer. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. So we're just going to talk real quick about some considerations if you're working with a bloodstain pattern analyst and it's involved in your case, particularly cold cases. So can we go on to the next slide? So again, we're going to examine thoroughly every aspect of the cold case file, everything that we have collected, so that we have a good idea of what's going on in our case. So the initial incident reports, any follow-up or supplemental reports, the crime scene photographs. And I think when Jennifer was talking about how they photograph now and then maybe what was done previously, like is there going to be that scale in every shot? Is that pattern approach, the approach that you use, the road mapping, going to be done so that if we didn't have it analyzed before, will an analyst today be able to do that? And I think Jennifer can talk a little bit about that when she goes back to her report writing or at any time. Diagrams that may have been done, videos. The evidence log is always a helpful thing to look at. What was seized, and then maybe why was it seized, depending on what it is. Often it's stuff that's collected because it was on a suspect or something like that. But at the crime scene, what all was collected and why was it? The autopsy, any lab reports. And of course, we're going to want to look at the victim witness interviews and the suspect interviews that were done at the time. And I really think about cold case sexual assaults because, you know, if this is an older case, maybe the interview with the victim wasn't particularly victim-centered or trauma-informed, or we used best practices and we may not have gotten the best information. A victim may have shut down because of how they were treated or the questions they were asked. Even good questions like, you know, you in a sexual assault case, you might want to ask about what were you wearing, because we want to collect that clothing to see if we're going to test it, if there's any evidence, DNA or something like that. But a victim might be thinking you're suggesting that what she wore invited the assault, right? So now we sort of do a little better job of that. We explain everything we're asking. Might not have been done then. Same with the suspect. We may not have been as offender focused. And so we might need to redo those. If this is a case where the victim is still available, we might need to re-interview the victim. We're also, of course, going to have a protocol in place to contact a victim of a cold case if we have decided that we're going to investigate or go forward again. So those are just some things to think about. Go to the next. And of course, we're going to consult with the investigator. What were their impressions? Is the investigator still available? And if no evidence was collected, no bloodstain evidence was collected, why wasn't it collected? If it was collected, was it important part of this case? And I'm thinking usually it's going to be, but maybe not necessarily, depending on what other evidence they were able to collect at the time, or the case may not turn on the blood evidence. Even if it is significant, we still have other good evidence that allows us to go forward. Next slide. And then if there was a previous report done, let's review that report and see what was examined, how was it examined? Did the analyst go to the scene or did they do an analysis based on crime scene photos? How much detail is in the report? And is the analyst still available, which could implicate some of our confrontation rights that the defendant has if the original analyst isn't available. So we'll have to think about that. But we also might be consulting with a current analyst, and they can review and help us understand what was done, what wasn't done, and if good conclusions can be made from the previous report, how much detail was in there. If the original analyst is available, we're going to provide them with their original report and access to the evidence while maintaining that chain of custody, of course. And then we'll review the report and the conclusions with them. And Jennifer talked really well about this. I feel like those couple of slides about the history of BPA, it would be helpful in court to demonstrate, hey, things have changed and here's how they have improved. And that might be something that we need to do to combat a defense challenge based on a cold case where things were maybe done differently. And also just the ability to say things have changed, but this was still quality work and they still did good things here. so that I can still make a conclusion, or I can look at this and tell you what's what. So those are things that we want to do if the original analyst is still available. If the original analyst isn't available, then we need to talk to the lab about that original report. Was someone else involved in creating that report? Was it peer reviewed? Because is there somebody else available who could testify about what was done in this report? The defendant has the right to confront the analyst based on the Crawford line of cases, Melendez, Diaz, et cetera. Is the original report sufficient for the new analyst to form an opinion? I.e., is there enough good documentation, photographs, notes that they can understand what happened at this scene and render an opinion about that? And if not, are there things so an analysis can be recreated? And that's probably going to rely on those photographs and documentation. Sometimes, in DNA, we keep samples so additional testing can be done, or the analyst doesn't use up the entire sample so that additional testing can be done. Sometimes we do have to get permission, say in a DNA case, to exhaust the existing sample, and we have to alert the defense and things. But anyway, we're going to talk to our analysts, our current analysts, to make sure we know what's what about what was done previously, and can they render an opinion based on that. And then, so these are the cases, Melendez, Diaz, Bull Cumming, and Williams v. Illinois, that talk about the defendant's right to confront the analyst. And these are cases where in Melendez, Diaz, that was a drug case. The analyst wasn't called, and they, now you have to call that, or you have to have a notice and demand situation where the defense has the right. You give them notice that there was an analyst involved, et cetera, in their certificate of analysis, and then they can say, hey, that analyst has to come and testify. Bull Cumming was a DUI case where, again, they had to have an analyst present. That original analyst had left, and they could not come up with someone who could testify as to what was done in the original analysis. And Williams v. Illinois was a rape case where a current DNA analysis was done based on a previous sample that was collected and analyzed, and the original analyst was not available, but the current analyst was. It's an odd case, but the court said it was okay for the current analyst to rely on a previous analysis to render their opinion. So we have a resource on all that Melendez, Diaz, in that line of cases, that's progeny. So please reach out and check that out if you're ever in that situation where you have to get a new analysis or a new analyst, and we can help you figure out if you're going to be able to do that. Next. If there's no bloodstain report available, let's look at what evidence was collected in the case and figure out, can something still be done in that case? What can you tell us based on the evidence that you have there? And your new analyst will be able to tell you what they're able to say and what they're not able to say. And it's interesting in just talking with not just Jennifer, but other forensic experts in different fields. All of them have told me at one point or another, they've felt pressure from a prosecutor to say a certain thing, and they've had to push back and say, no, I can't say that. So that's good. We want our experts to be able to do that, and we don't want to be pressuring them. So even if you have a theory of the case and you're thinking about how this might have gone down, that analyst is going to be able to tell you what they can say about that evidence. And we might want them to go a step too far, or they're going to tell us, hey, your theory is not fitting with the evidence, which is good. I want to be on the same page with the physical evidence in the case. Next. So, and we'll go on to the next slide. What are we going to do to prepare for this? Obviously, we have to subpoena our experts well in advance of trial. Sometimes, depending on the expertise, we might do a motion to introduce this expert testimony. Not often, but sometimes the defense will file a motion to prohibit, a motion in limine to prohibit the evidence from coming in. So we're going to prepare for whatever that is. We subpoena them. We review the evidence and expert conclusions with them. We've got our working theory of the case, and I just want to make sure I'm on the same page with what the analysis says, and that I'm not misinterpreting it because I think it says something that helps me, and it maybe really doesn't, maybe because I'm not an expert. So we'll start with that report, and then we'll go over it with the analyst and review all the things that are going to come up. Typically, the way I would do it when I'm presenting expert testimony is let's just go over what the qualifications of that expert are. The CV, the expert's curriculum vitae, is usually the roadmap for that. And we just go through where do you work, things like that. We've got some examples of qualifying questions. Then we talk about the foundation of the science that they're, so the BPA, that science, we're going to talk about how that came to be and how you sort of what Jennifer was talking about, maybe not in all that detail, but we would get that foundation of the science and then how they're applying that science to the evidence in this case. We're also going to prepare by talking about what do you anticipate the defense arguments might be in this case? What do you think they're going to go after? And that helps me prepare as well. Next slide. So we'll consult with the expert regarding all discovery requests from the defense as well. And I've had a bunch of cases where the defense often requests a lot of discovery, particularly related to lab protocols, proficiency testing, things that the analyst did, their notes, all of that stuff. And look, we've got to turn all that stuff over. So we're going to work with the expert and the lab to collect all that information, share it with the defense, and then go over it with our analyst, because sometimes I've gotten it where it's stacks of information and I'm going through it and it's stuff I just don't know what it is. And they're going to prep me for it because I don't know how the defense is going to respond. I've seen it where I think the defense is often just doing this, hoping we won't respond thoroughly or send everything we're supposed to, and then they'll file a motion to suppress because we didn't respond to discovery, or they'll object at trial. And I've seen when we've fully responded, they end up doing nothing with it. But I can't take that chance. I've got to be ready to go. So I need my analyst to prepare me for that. We're going to, of course, share our expert CV with the defense and our discovery and give them access to our expert. I am also available if the expert is uncomfortable talking to the defense on their own. I will make myself available to be part of that interview if they like. And if the defense is calling their expert, then I'm going to share their CV with my expert, because often in that field, people know one another and they know when there's a defense expert who's coming along saying things that might not be sound, or they're explaining things in a way that's creating doubt where there isn't a lot of doubt. So I do want the help from my analyst to prepare to cross-examine that defense expert. I also always call the defense expert and just talk to them after I've talked to my expert, so I can find out what they're planning on saying. If they won't talk to you, you can use that to impeach their credibility. And when they do talk to you, it just helps me get a feel for what they're going to do. And honestly, you know, I worry about there being a bogus expert, but honestly, good experts are going to talk to you. They may have a slightly different conclusion, or they may see an area where there could be some doubt. But if they're a good expert, my expert may already know that and may help me ask them questions so that we're all on the same page before they testify. Next slide. And so how am I going to present this evidence at trial? We're going to figure out the most effective way to present it. Do we, you know, are we going to project these images or show the jury as they go along? Are we going to have physical exhibits, demonstrative exhibits, enlargements so that they can see things? And how are we going to handle physical evidence during the trial? It's just helpful when you've mapped this out so that you don't end up doing something awkward or mishandle a piece of evidence, or I don't want to hand somebody something covered in blood and ask them to handle it. They don't have gloves or something else. So we just want to go through all those logistics so that we don't have something embarrassing happen at trial. Next. Again, the discovery request, every agency may have its own rules. The analyst or the laboratory can provide us all of this information that we will then provide on to the defense, the CV, the report, any case notes, chain of custody information, the standard operating procedures of the lab. It might be the certifications that the lab has received as well, and any other documentation they may request. Next. Of course, we're going to subpoena our analyst. If you're working with a federal witness, a federal bloodstain pattern analyst, you might have to do a TUI letter, which is basically a request to the government to turn over documents or a witness for a case. And so it's just something simple that's usually not going to be a big deal if you've been working with a federal analyst for some reason on your case. And analysts don't necessarily have to testify in grand jury, so let's not overburden them with testimony. If we don't have to, you can usually just introduce those reports, so it may not be necessary. Next. And so again, we're going to meet with our analysts ahead of time, talk about their availability. Of course, as a prosecutor, I can maybe time their testimony so they don't have to sit and for days waiting to testify. We'll talk about the analysis that was conducted, limitations of the science, what they can tell me, what they can't tell me, any current court challenges that they're monitoring that are going on, because a lot of my analysts will give me a heads up. Hey, there's a movement right now amongst the defense to attack this aspect of blood stain pattern analysis or fingerprint analysis or something like that. And they might be currently using the NAS report or something like that. So we want to make sure that we're ready for any of those challenges, because some of the science, as much as I might understand it in a working sort of way, it could be over my head. And so I just want to make sure I'm prepared to respond to those arguments. Also, a lot of the analysts I've worked with have a sort of scripted set of qualifying questions, how they like to go through it. So if that already exists, let's get it from them. If it doesn't, we can go through it as I would typically for any expert. Next. And here's just a standard list, obviously state your name, where you employed, what's your title, how long have you done this, what are your official duties, what's your education, what other training do you have in this area, have you been testified as an expert before? Every expert has to testify for the first time. I've had that happen to me a couple times, and they've done a great job. So it doesn't matter if they haven't done this before. These guys really know their stuff and they're experts. So that's not a challenge. And we can obviously get them across the finish line that way. And then talk about what the science of bloodstain pattern analysis might be. So, and then the ongoing training and the proficiency testing, you might want to get into those things as well. But again, work with your analyst to talk about what they're going to do. Often, you might go on to ask questions about articles written, things like that. Some people have done that, others have not. It's fine. It doesn't have an impact, but I'm not going to ask a question if I know the answer is no. So we'll prep all that ahead of time. Next slide. So what are the defense likely to go after? Maybe the expert's qualifications. Have they been trained to competency? Have they been certified? Are they qualified by an outside entity or their own agency? Do they get that regular proficiency testing? Jennifer mentioned it's once a year. So that's a good thing to bring out. Their continuing education, anything that they've contributed to as far as research, publications, or any memberships in those organizations that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning. When I'm qualifying my expert, I do want to go through all of this so the jury knows this is a great expert. So I want to get as much of this information in front of them as we can. I don't want to have the defense just stipulate, yeah, we have no objection, they're an expert. I want the jury to know they're an expert. So make sure we go through this each time. They might challenge lab protocols. Is it accredited? And as Jennifer pointed out, maybe the lab's accredited, but the blood stain pattern analysis is not an accredited portion of the lab. So we have to know about that. Standard operating procedures, were they available and followed in the case. And I see Toby weighing in here. He works with both the prosecution and defense, and just says, I can't talk to the other side off the record. It's not via sworn deposition. So how would my not talking to you when you call me on the phone undermine my credibility? I would hopefully be asked during testimony to explain to the jury why I declined to discuss the case with you on the phone. So I've had experts who've refused to talk to me on the phone or refused to share information with me. If it's something like, I don't want to talk to you right now on the phone, can we meet? Or I would rather have the prosecutor present when we discuss it, that's one thing. But if you just simply refuse to talk to me, I would probably suggest to the jury that you might not be be forthcoming about what you're doing. And so I would recommend that we do have communication, that you are available to the defense. that if you feel like you can't talk to them off the record, then we'd have to create a situation where you can communicate with them fairly. Because at least in my practice, we regularly had our experts available to the other side, and we regularly accessed the experts on the other side. And they did usually talk to us, and it was usually over the phone in my experience. I did have an expert who refused to talk to me, and I did use that against him in court, just to suggest what is it you were hiding that you couldn't tell me over the phone. So you might have other concerns that are legitimate, and we could explain those to the court. But if you can talk to the other side, that's what I would do. Next. You might get a Fryer-Daubert challenge, and it might be based on the National Academy of Sciences report that's maybe challenging the science. And so we're going to work with our expert to respond to that appropriately. We'll get a copy of the motion. We'll work with the prosecutor, the analyst will work to write a good response, explain everything about the science, address any points in there raised in the motion. Don't allow misleading or false statements to go unchallenged if their motion to challenge this science includes something like that. Ensure that we have a hearing so that we can argue it and have our analysts explain things to the court that the court's going to look at. The court is the gatekeeper for any scientific information expertise that comes in. And so we just want to make sure that they know that this is reliable. There are a series of Daubert elements that we want to address in those. And so is this peer reviewed? Is it generally accepted? Is it testable? Is there an error rate? Things like that. So all of those things we want to prepare with our expert and explain to the court what this science is about and that it is reliable. Next. And then the NAS report may form the basis for the challenge to the testimony and to the science itself. And just remember, this is a quote from the report, that they basically said they couldn't go into every element of each discipline, but that they found some general issues that were happening across the board. If we go to the next slide, and I think Jennifer talked about some of these. So there may be lack of standards in terminology, conclusions, things like that. Lack of validity testing, overstatement of conclusions is something that they saw, saying that so they were absolutely certain about things. Lack of statistical report, error rates, the sources of errors, a lack of scientific culture, or that cognitive bias or confirmation bias. So we just want to make sure that we're able to address any of those challenges and work closely with our analysts to make sure that we can respond to any challenge related to those things. And I think that's it. And it's back to Jennifer.
Thank you. I just, to wrap things up, want to go through report writing and testimony best practices and make a comparison to old reports that you may have if you are looking at a cold case that does have a bloodstain pattern report versus how they're currently being written. So any bloodstain pattern report should have all of the evidence that was received, and some of that evidence may be photographs, may be clothing or objects that were collected from the scene. There should also be a section of case information giving just a general summary of the situation at hand. Maybe the location, did it happen indoors versus outdoors? And if there were any specific questions or theories that we're trying to prove or disprove, that should definitely be listed here as well. And we can get into that when we talk about testimony. And if that was a biasing factor, that can be a defense challenge that can come up sometimes. And then most of the time, you're going to receive supplemental reports and materials, meaning if I'm going to make a conclusion, for example, that states that there's a projected pattern, that's my classification, but my opinion may be that it was the mechanism of deposition was from arterial bleeding. So I know that's one of the questions that was asked was, is it called projected bleeding? The answer is no, it's called arterial bleeding, but it produces a projected pattern. So I would never make an opinion that a projected pattern came from an arterial bleed if I didn't have a corresponding medical report stating that an artery was breached, if that makes sense, right? I'm going to make sure that I've got supporting documentation before I make that conclusion or come anywhere close to making that conclusion. So I'm going to list everything that I had, the medical reports, any witness statements, any additional photographs, if there were photographs taken from the agency prior to my arrival at the scene, all of those things. And then I'm going to list the methods of my specific examination. Did I physically look at the evidence? Did I use a microscope to look at the evidence? Did I do experimentation to try and recreate the patterns? All of my methods should be thoroughly documented. Also, a lot of assumptions are going to be made during the processing. For example, we're probably not going to test every single stain to see if it was blood, but we might test some of those stains. We're going to want to make sure that that's included in the report. Assumptions that all reddish brown staining was blood versus these are the ones that were tested, these are the ones that were not tested. And you know, depending on what was done in that case, that might be really specific or not. Do you have any reporting limitations? Meaning, are you working off of poor quality photos without scales or, you know, not at a 90-degree orientation? So you might be getting some skewed images. All of those limitations need to be documented. I'm examining clothing, that clothing was previously handled by, you know, X, Y, and Z units, the biology unit, the trace evidence unit, things like that. So how pristine is your evidence? Maybe this case has been retried and we may know some information that this evidence was handled, maybe with gloves, maybe without. These are all questions that we might want to know, or assumptions that were being made, that artifacts are present or not. And then there should be a section about your classifications of your blood stains. So making the determination, is this an impact pattern? Is it a cast off pattern? And usually we'll go through the report and typically we may even have a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with the report, and we may very specifically say refer to photograph 50 for this classification so that we've got corresponding photographs. Sometimes the photographs will specifically be in the report. And then the opinion or interpretation section indicating what type of mechanism of deposition. So we know that it's an impact pattern, but how did it get there? Or where do we think the person or the object that had blood on it was located at the time of impact? And then at the very end, you should have your qualifying statements, meaning essentially anything that was used is listed in this report. And if any new information comes to light, we reserve the right to modify any opinions that were made, which makes sense, right? If more information becomes available, we should be ready, willing, and able to use that information to change any conclusions we may have come up with. Also, you should have glossary of terms, and those glossary of terms should be, depending on when the report was written, it may be those 2009 swig stain terms, or now the ASB terms, which if I believe correctly, they're pretty much the same set of terms, but they should be listed which set is being used. And then briefly talking about sequential unmasking, really we're talking about when you look at all of this information. So I may list in my report that I had the medical examiner's report and all these witness statements, but if I conduct an unbiased investigation, I don't need to look at any of that evidence until after my analysis is conducted. So I don't need any of that information to say a stain is projected, for example, in order to make a conclusion that it's consistent with coming from an arterial bleed. Yeah, then I would need the medical report. So I document when I received the information and then when I actually read the information. And a good analyst would have made all of their notes, their classifications before they make their opinions, before they're going to make those classifications before they look at any of the additional information. So that's all good documentation from the examiner. And then same thing goes with any additional information. Do I have DNA results? If there are DNA results in the case, I certainly would like to use them in my report to help clarify if there are multiple bleeders, remember, we're doing crime scene reconstruction. So if I'm able to say this impact pattern came from this specific individual, that's going to be really helpful, right? If I can say that there's a footwear report stating that this shoe made this impression, then I'm going to want to, use that in my report. And I already mentioned the things that we can do with the medical examiner's report. So all of this is really helpful. A lot of times I'll send specific samples to DNA because I'm interested in some of the conclusions I may be able to make based off of that type of testing. So all things to consider. When the witness does get on the stand, I do really recommend that you use a PowerPoint presentation so you can pictorially show some of the things that you're talking about. It can get technical and it can get confusing. Really take the time to set up that foundation and make sure that you understand whatever limitations are present. Most of the questions that get asked, usually the prosecution does a good job of setting you up and you kind of know what questions might be asked. But the defense will then show up and then they're just like, but what if this? What if this? Is this scenario possible? It's important that the analyst remembers to stay in their lane. If their work has been peer reviewed, that's what they can testify to. Now is not the time to start rendering new opinions. So it takes a little bit of effort on the analyst's part to sit and think and say, that is an interesting theory. It hasn't been vetted out. There may be experimentations necessary, and that is what it is if it had not been addressed in the report. So when I write my reports, I do try to think of all the scenarios possible and address them right there in the report and do all of that work up front, because it's not a very comfortable situation to be on the stand and have to, sort of assert yourself and say, I really can't make that opinion because it hasn't been reviewed. And back to John.
Just in closing, going forward, again, we want to develop a relationship with our analysts in law enforcement and the bloodstain pattern analysts so that we have a good working relationship, a good understanding of how this works, and that we'll be really prepared for trial. We want to work closely with our analysts to educate the fact finder, the judge and jury, about the evidence. And we're going to provide the defense with appropriate notice and discovery and access to the analyst so that they can prepare adequately. And we'll anticipate and rebut any defense challenges that we think are going to come up. And I think, as you were just saying, Jennifer, you can't always predict everything that they're going to say, but we want to be ready as best we can. And working closely with the analyst is going to be the best way to do that. So we had a couple of questions. One, I think you addressed, Jennifer, about the projected bleeding versus arterial bleeding. Did you want to weigh in on that again, or you? Thank you.
Yeah, just to be clear that the projected pattern that I might see, that's what I'm going to say is projected, but the mechanism of deposition would be from an arterial bleed. You can get a projected pattern that's created from something aside from an arterial bleed. That's just one of the possibilities for the mechanism of deposition. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other question was related to working with when there's a defense expert. Do you ever have joint statements for the court from experts listing statements of agreement and disagreement? So here are the two that are opining in the case, and they agree on these things, but they disagree on certain things. I haven't done that before, but Jennifer, do you have experience with that? I think that would be super helpful if we can do that.
No. So am I understanding it correctly that you're having two experts on opposing sides and they agree? So you're just coming together and saying as such in court?
That's what I read that statement to mean, the question to me, but I don't have experience with that. And we might be cutting into time. And I just also, and Toby weighed back in that he cannot talk to the defense without a court order. So obviously you would have to make some arrangement to either get a court order, otherwise you could not talk to the defense about the case, or anyone apparently. So just wanted to say that. I think we're at time. So Lisa, did you want to come back in?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer and John, for presenting with us today. We really appreciate the time that you've taken and all the valuable information that you've shared. I did launch our poll questions. If our attendees could take a moment to fill those out, we would really appreciate your feedback. And yes, it looks like you did address all the questions that I have seen. And so I'll go ahead and give you the floor if there's any other last comments that you want to make before we close out for the day.
Well, thank you everybody for attending and for the questions. And thanks, Jennifer, for that. That was really fascinating. I thought that was so well presented. It gives us a good idea about bloodstain pattern analysis.
Thank you. And if it was overwhelming, there's my contact info. Feel free to reach out at any time. I could talk about this stuff for hours. So reach out if you need anything.
Thank you so much, both of you. And again, we will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we will post it on the Saki website. And we'll also send out an email announcement to all who have registered, which will also include a copy of the presentation, and that will also be posted on the website with the archive as well. So I think we are all set for today. I'm going to leave the room open just for another minute or two as I see a lot of poll responses coming through. So thank you everybody for participating in that. And again, thank you so much to our presenters, and we hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon.